Camp professionals know that mental health is a challenge at camp, but often being able to articulate just where the gaps in our knowledge is can be challenging. Today, our guest Erin Sunstrum shares with us how she identified those gaps and has taken steps in her own camping journey to help bridge those and better serve the youth at her organization. Welcome to Beyond Camp, where we explore the intersection of camp in our lives. For too long, camp professionals have referred to camp as being in a bubble, and we're here to burst that bubble with you today. We know that camp intersects with every aspect of our lives. We're excited to delve into those. We are your hosts, Rachel Kent. My pronouns are she, her,
And I'm Cassie Bloyd. My pronouns are also she, her.
and we're here to go beyond camp with you. As a reminder, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening today, and be sure to check out the show notes at gocamp.pro/beyondcamp. Now, let's get started. Today, I am thrilled to be introducing our guest, Erin Sunstrum. She is the current director at Camp Wanapate and has worked in camping for 18 years. She has a Bachelor's of Arts and Bachelor's of Education and is currently a master's student in counseling psychology, which is what we're going to be talking about today. She's a longtime volunteer of the Ontario Camps Association, which is how I met Erin, working on the OCA Connects annual conference committee, and she is the chair of the newly created ongoing member education committee. She's a proud cat mom to Scout and Dax and proud aunt to Owen and Riley, who I clarified are humans. And she's a grandma level crafter, knitting, crochet, and embroidery and macrame. Erin, welcome. We're so excited to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really great to be here.
And such an impressive bio. So many great connections to camping. And if you ever have the pleasure of meeting Erin, you'll know just how welcoming and inviting she is into the camping world.
Oh my goodness, Rachel, I'm blushing. Thank you.
So let's get started. Erin, we like to sort of skip the typical question of tell us about yourself, because it's really open-ended. But we would like to ask you how you identify. And the reason why we use this phrasing is because we think that identities are really important and we want to normalize using that language in a variety of circumstances. So Erin, how do you identify and what words might you use to identify yourself?
Absolutely. And totally agree. I identify, I think the biggest thing in my identity is that I identify as a woman. I am a cisgendered female. I am also white. And then through my bio, you heard a lot of other important parts of my identity. I identify as a camp director, as a student, as an aunt, and a pet mom. Those are sort of key components of who I am.
Nice. I just want to dive into that for just a second, because a lot of the time, some of those identities for a lot of people would be like a main identity. People would be like, I'm a student or I'm a camp director. And for those of us who are camp directors, have been camp directors, that can be like an all-encompassing identity. At least it was for me. It's part of why I loved it and part of the challenge of it. How does that work with your identity as a student? Like, do you find that they conflict a lot? Are you able to balance them? Do you give more weight to one than another in different seasons of your life?
I definitely think balance is that key part of it. Despite the belief that, camp directors only work 2 months a year, we know that it's a full-time job. But that being said, there's obviously times that are a little bit more conducive to exploring other avenues. And so, summertime, which in my mind is really May through to the end of August, camp director that's the biggest one. And then for the rest of the year, I do a little bit of a balance. And the whole thing with me is, it's part of my identity as a student is just my love of learning. And so I wanted to find a way to prioritize that in my life in a way that was going to be, helpful to my career path and also just engaging in interests that I had outside of the camp world.
That's awesome. And I think really important, because I think, as Cassie and I have discussed, there's always a chance that you could lose part of your identity. And so nurturing those other identities is really important. And I will say for folks listening that Erin has a fabulous set of boundaries that she uses to help protect those different identities. And because she has said to me, Rachel, I don't have time for this new project you're trying to rope me into because of X, Y, and Z. And I know that I can say no because I need to protect this time for other things. So I admire that about Erin.
See, I appreciate that because I still feel like that's something that I continually struggle with. It's, saying no is something that is an ongoing struggle for me, especially because, oftentimes I'm presented with opportunities that really excite me. And those are the hardest to say no to. But, as I've experienced through my own professional and personal life, without those boundaries, I end up not being able to be the best version of myself or the best version of any of those identities that I've talked about. And so, prioritizing that and being able to give as much as I can to those more important things has made saying no a little bit easier, but I'm definitely still working on it.
That's so impressive and just like totally fair to be working on it, because it is one of those things I think too, it's just like it's ongoing, especially for those of us who are like, yeah, sure. It's a harder thing to learn. But we want to kind of move on a little bit and talk about privilege, because that is something that exists in our world too. So do you think about your privilege on a regular basis, and what privilege do you carry with you?
Absolutely. I think privilege is something that I really started to become more engaged with starting in university. And honestly, that speaks to my own privilege that I was able to not really have those thoughts and conversations until I was entering into my late teens and early 20s. And then I'm finding, with the more work that I do in camp and my specific counseling program, we talk a lot about privilege and where it comes from. And so that's something that I'm working to actively engage with. I come from a huge place of privilege. I am a cisgendered white person. And I come from an upper middle class background, which means, things like attaining post-secondary education. I've gone to school a lot. I work full time. There's a lot that's worked in my favor in terms of privilege. And so becoming more conscious of that and, working now to integrate that more into approaching people with more humility is something that's really at that next stage of what I'm trying to work with now.
Amazing. I like that you're kind of like taking that and shifting it and continuing that growth and learning opportunity and identifying it as you go in different aspects. So when we think about like privilege and identity, do you as a leader feel responsible, or maybe do you feel pressure to discuss that?
Yeah, I think, I was reflecting on this a little bit, and I think, again, part of that privilege of being white and presenting as cisgendered means that I have not been pressured to explore a lot of my identities, or been pressured to share it. But I think it's become more important to, I'm trying to make it more of a priority. I think, again, it's like in an effort to help normalize the conversations about it a bit more. And also, I think it's important to recognize too that everyone is going to come from a place where, they're not always having visible components of their identity or their privilege. And so the more that we're able to talk about it, the more we're able to learn from each other, and also recognize where some of those matches and maybe mismatches are going to be when we're working with each other.
I like that phrase of the match versus mismatch. I think that's really cool. And that's a good way of looking at it as well. It's kind of unique. I haven't heard that phrase before.
Take some counseling psychology program stuff, and hopefully you'll be able to hear a bit more. That's something that I've been learning a lot about with the program, and it's been awesome because I think I've been able to find ways to apply it outside of just this counseling study that I'm doing right now.
Now I'm intrigued and I want to go and Google this and sign up. Also contemplating the fact that I told you how many hours I slept last night, and the one thing I need right now is probably not more things on my plate, but we'll shelve that for later. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Cassie, did you have a follow-up? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just so impressed that I'm hearing that all of this student stuff that's passing over into regular day life. And I'm like, how can I do more? So it's okay. I'm just sitting here going, what do I want to learn? Maybe I should sign up for that master's.
Well, I think the thing with that too is obviously this is stuff that I'm learning continuing through this program, but I'm also recognizing that it's not necessarily unique to that. And the biggest piece is really just, it's that curiosity that both of you are showing. And I think as, we as a society are starting to get better at recognizing, you know, the ways that we're different and the ways that that can both challenge and enhance the way that we interact with each other, more and more resources are being available. So you don't necessarily have to do the committing, you know, 3+ years of your life to a master's degree to do that, which is also great.
Absolutely. So this is a great segue into sort of this next chunk of the podcast here, because you currently work at camp. You're a co-director, correct? Which is a big undertaking, as we are all aware. But you're also in school, which is also a massive undertaking. And that's a lot to do all at once. So what made you decide to dive into all of this all at the same time? Because you're also a relatively new director,
Yes.
not new full-time to camping, but new to directing.
Yes, yeah. So, you know, for history's sake, I just started my role as a director at the very end of 2019, and I started my master's program in September of 2020. My path to get into pursuing higher education has been a bit of an ongoing journey. Again, I'm a nerd. I love learning. I love school, and the more time that I spent working full time in camping, the more that I was coming across situations where I was just like, I just feel like I want to know more about mental health, and I just wish that there were more resources available for camps in particular in this field. And in classic, you know, type A fashion, I was like, well, then the solution is obviously that maybe I do something that I can be a contributor to that over time. So yeah, I decided to start taking some courses just to help boost my application, and also just to test the waters to see what it was like to be a student while also working full time, to see that it was manageable before diving in. Did a lot of research and was able to find a program that allowed for asynchronous learning and was really catered to students that are also working full time. So I lucked out big time in that department. And also, full disclosure, I mean, you know, the pandemic has been absolutely terrible, but it's really good for being a student and doing work because you can't do much else at this time. So having, you know, starting basically right in the middle of COVID allowed me to get some of those routines and stuff down on a little bit more pattern, so that when things, you know, started to open up a little bit more, I already had those steps in place where I was like, okay, I'm getting better at saying no because I know how much time it takes me to do this assignment.
That makes sense. You mentioned in there that there were things at camp that sort of like nudged you to be like, I need to know more about this. I need to know more about this. Now, without getting into like a specific situation, because we've all faced a variety of situations, what sorts of things started that prompting for you where you're like, oh, there's more that I should know that maybe just isn't available on Google, or that I need a deeper understanding of?
For sure. You know, I think obviously mental health has been a huge and increasingly more prominent issue that folks have been coming across in their day-to-day lives. And I found with, you know, the more work that I was doing with camper care and also staff supports, I was just looking for more help to better communicate and support campers and staff just on a day-to-day basis. I wanted to make sure that I was using the right language with them. I wanted to make sure that, you know, I was identifying when, you know, maybe my level of support was not sufficient, and then just helping to, you know, create a little bit more of a positive culture of mental health at camp. And so, you know, I took mental health first aid courses. I took that piece, and it was still, it wasn't giving me quite the tools that I was looking for. And again, as I mentioned, like, you know, the challenge of finding really solid mental health training opportunities for professional staff has been difficult. And so that was just a gap that I said, you know what, like maybe if I knew more, number one, I would know what to look for when I was looking for existing training. But then also maybe I can help identify gaps where some new training opportunities could come up over the years too.
You mentioned that you were lacking tools. What tools do you think you were lacking? Like just the ability to engage in conversations, to help people through stuff? Like what from your toolbox was missing, do you think?
I think the biggest struggle, which I know a lot of people go through, is concern about saying the wrong thing. I think a lot of training tools are designed for necessarily, like, and they're necessary, but managing crisis situations. And I think a lot of times it's, you know, we're starting to realize that, you know, our campers, our staff are not necessarily going to have a diagnosed mental disorder. They may not necessarily be in a mental health crisis, but they're still needing support. And so I was looking for tools of better ways to just engage in a supportive, non-judgmental way with these folks that I was helping to support. And just, yeah, like identifying opportunities to make sure that, the camp culture as a whole too was being affirming of people's mental health struggles and making sure that those supports were in place for our community as a whole.
Absolutely. I love that. I think that all camp folks want that. And I love that you were able to identify that and articulate that versus just be like, there's something missing and I don't know what it is. I think you took like a really action oriented approach to that, which is fabulous. Erin, this has been so great so far. We're going to take a quick pause here for our ad. And then when we are right back, Cassie is going to dive into it, looking back at your time as a camper and staff member.
The American Camp Association of Illinois believes in the transformative power of camp, with our work historically rooted in using camp as a tool for social change in both local and national communities. We envision a world where all children and young people have equitable access to camp opportunities. Join us in our journey today at acail.org. Thank you so much for sharing everything so far, Erin. It's like so much is just like sparking in my brain and being like, oh my goodness, like these are the words that I think people might even be missing of like, what have I been thinking? And like seeing those gaps, but not necessarily knowing how to like apply and like move forward through them. But we want to go a little bit more and reflect back a bit. So are there any lessons you learned from camp, either as a camper or a staff member, that you carry with you now or take time to reflect on?
Yeah, I think, the biggest piece that I've learned and like to hold with me comes from my own experience as a camper, specifically around, mental health and engagement, in that like I was the kid that cried myself out of summer camp. I did not go through a lot of time as a camper. When I was a child, I was a Girl Guide, just represent for Rachel there. And that was where my overnight camping experience pretty much started and ended. And I had a lot of great times sometimes, but I was also the kid that second day of camp had been crying so hard that I got sent home. And that sort of piece really carried with me because, turn around less than 10 years later, I came back into the camping world and loved it. And I think the biggest piece that has come out of that is that notion of never giving up on camp as an option for folks, and the whole concept of, right place and right time for people. And that, both from experiencing it directly, of learning that not being able to necessarily complete a program in a traditional way because I was struggling didn't make me a failure in any way, and it didn't reflect negatively on camp as a whole. It just wasn't the right fit at that right time. And I like to keep that with me, and it's been super helpful, especially with talking with parents with kids that are struggling and who want that experience so badly for their children, and that it's not where they're at right now.
That is such a impactful story. And I feel like I hear it more frequently from camp directors, that they were the kid that struggled at camp in one way or another. And I love the phrasing because I also believe it, like not every camp is for every kid, but there is a camp out there for every kid. And you also just have to pick the time. And that's such a hard conversation to have, of like, when's the right time for your kid? So thank you for sharing that, because I think that's an important lesson for people to grasp onto.
No problem. Yeah, and it's so true. And I love what you said about, directors being the ones that often struggled as children. I think it really speaks to, this industry as a whole, and the desire to, help better something that we hold so dear, and like recognizing the really positive stuff about it, but also part of being a good director, I think, is recognizing that it's not always going to be easy and figuring out how to support accordingly.
Yes, if I was Ruby, I would be snapping right now. It's that idea that I like to talk about all the time, is holding two ideas in tension. We can love something and we can be critical of it. We can love something and also say, this is not the best time for it. this is amazing and everybody needs to go to camp, but not everybody needs to go to camp at the exact same time. So should every child go to camp? Let's say we're going to say yes, that's great. Should every child go to camp when they are 8 years old? Maybe not. Maybe not every 8-year-old is ready. And I think that nuance and understanding and individualization is really important, and having a director who understands that, I think, is really powerful.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think, it's one of the biggest concerns, I think, on behalf of, like, from the directors and from parents, is worrying about considering an experience like that to be a failure for a child. And I think, being able to teach folks to pivot that a little bit more and focus on where the successes are. It's, giving it a try. And my biggest one too is, like, congratulating the child for advocating for themselves a lot. They're the ones that are saying, I'm not ready. This place is not for me. And that is something that, adults still struggle with. They really struggle to say, I can't do this. This isn't for me. And so focusing on those as positive life skills, rather than, seeing not being able to attend camp or having to leave early, as something that they should be ashamed of.
I love that. Um, we've sort of touched on this, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this now. How has camp shaped the way that you work with young people? And I know that you aren't actively working as a counselor right now, but when you think about that, when you're going to school and looking about how you're going to work with people, how has camp shaped that work?
I think it's huge. I mean, I have always loved working with kids, and it did take me a little bit of time to sort of realize that. But the minute I started working at camp, I knew that that was, the ultimate goal for me, is somehow I want to do this, which started us off as teachers college for me. And then I realized, a couple months into teaching, like, I'm wanting to teach because I want summers off to go to camp. And so, I can imagine that camp has made it so that working with kids is something that I always want, in my life. And it's just really taught me, I think, over the years, that people don't tend to give children enough credit, I think, for their own level of self-awareness, for their own level of skill and ability, and just the amazing ways that their brains work. And so I think that's something that camp has really taught me, by being able to spend a lot more time, with kids who are exploring new experiences and trying new things and overcoming and facing new challenges, is just to be really conscious of how awesome these little humans are, and how much they really have to contribute if you just take a minute to really watch and listen.
Like, that's really neat that you were like, we don't value like kids' experiences enough. And I think that's true in a lot of circumstances. We often don't value life experiences. We value things. And this is likely really a colonial concept, to be honest. I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here, Cassie. I apologize. But we really value things like university degrees. We really value like that, like westernized or colonial, that's not the right word, like colonial way of thinking, that it has to be proven, has to be academic, etc. But we don't often value that lived experience, and an 8-year-old knows themselves best, right? And they know what they're living and what they're experiencing right there, and we shouldn't discredit that because they're young. And we also shouldn't discredit like a family knowing that like maybe their child is ready to come home from camp, or whatever the situation might be that they're facing.
Yeah, totally. I think, at the end of the day, even with your own identities, they may look similar to someone else's on the surface, but how people define those identities is going to be different. And the person who's the master of that identity, kids, adults, everyone, is that individual. And that's where that listening and watching really comes into play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to touch on one more thing, and then I'll pass things over to Cassie, is that I think you're in a unique position going into counseling because you've seen kids, like you see them 24/7. And I mean, like right now, you're not like a cabin counselor per se in that like traditional sense, but you're seeing the whole scope of a child for a week, 2 weeks, a month. I know your camp does longer durations. And I think that's a really unique perspective that a lot of counselors might not have, is that if they don't have kids themselves, and I'm not saying that you need to have kids yourselves to be able to work with kids, I feel very strongly about that, but you're able to see their entire day and have that sort of like big picture concept of what it's like to be an 8-year-old without being an 8-year-old.
Totally. It's the only people that really get to see that full scope of a kid, sun up to sundown, bedtime, are really their camp staff and their parents. And then camp staff have that fun added benefit of being able to go through that experience, with someone else's child, and that sort of unique, more outsiders separated perspective that comes with that, which I think is 100% really, really valuable in the field of counseling.
And you're also seeing them in a social setting as well, not just at home, which is super unique. Okay, Cassie, over to you. I'm finished with my rambling for now.
It's all good. I'm just like absorbing all of this lovely conversation. So camps shaped a lot of what you do, Erin, and you're also a student. How, as you finish up with school and your master's degree, how are you going to make it work?
Such a good question. And I think something that I am still starting to figure out, which is fine. Again, it's, one of my things in life is, nothing ever needs to be set in stone or permanent. I went into this program with the goal of, again, coming up with potentially more creative interventions and training strategies for camp professionals, as well as being able to find some more tools to help in my own work as a camp director. Those are things that I'm already thankfully starting to be able to apply, even as I'm going through this degree. And from there, who knows, camp has been a part of my life for so long. I want it to always be a part of my life. I'm not sure what direction that may take, but I'm really enjoying sort of the journey and figuring out how it all fits together as it goes along.
I love that. You're like, it's just a journey. We're just going to take this and figure it out as it comes along, but that there's learnings. And I think that's the important part there, is like, there's always something you can take away from everything that you do.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's one of the great things that I've experienced, especially in the field of camping, like as someone who's honestly not great with surprises or change, is learning to find, though, the positive opportunities that come out of that. Like I think it's always good to go into something with a goal, but I'm learning and practicing more that it's equally important to not be so tunnel visioned on it that you're missing the fun things and interesting pieces that are going to come along on that journey that you weren't expecting when on the outset.
Cassie's doing a mic drop there for anyone who's not watching us on YouTube. Erin, I want to sort of just shift gears for a second on this, but still tied to this idea that you're going to be qualified as a counselor, but then also be a camp director. Do you think that the camping world holds space or has capacity for camp professionals who sort of have this dual track, who have another skill set? Do you think we value that enough? Do you think we should encourage that more? What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's a bit of a balance. I think recognizing too, as we talked about privilege early on, that those extra skills and education are not necessarily going to be feasible on a grand scale for a lot of folks. Again, there's a lot of privilege in me being able to do a master's. I think the industry as a whole is becoming more open to it. I'm having a lot of really wonderful conversations as I'm working to find some speakers for the upcoming OCA Reconnects conference. A little plug in there for you. Of camp pros that have done this, that have different educational backgrounds and are applying these skills to the camp environment. And I think, based on the feedback that I've heard from a lot of folks that have gone to trainings, where the most valuable ones, takeaways seem to be learning from people who've done both, who, maybe have a specialty that's outside of camping, but the biggest, most important piece is that they have that camp background. And so, yeah, balancing both roles, I think, can be challenging. I think a lot of people choose to move out of the field and come back to it into a more training capacity. But I'm hoping, as we start to evolve as a society, as to what work means, like what it means to have a career and a profession, that we start to catch up and be a little bit more flexible to folks having dual roles.
Excellent. Wow. I feel like there's so many like good things that Erin's saying, and I just want to like grasp them all, and like I can't find words because I'm trying to like absorb all of this stuff, and it's great. So before we wrap up, we want to take a moment to thank Erin for joining us today. It's been an absolute delight having you here today. We also want to know, how can our listeners contact you if they're interested in getting to know you or learning a little bit more about your story?
Absolutely. So the best way to reach me is by email. And my email is, you'll probably want to look in the show notes because my camp is hard to spell, but it's Erin@wanapitei.net. So WANAPITEI.net.
I'm glad you can spell that because there is no way I can. It will be in the show notes for everybody looking for it. And as you all know, we like to talk a little bit about self-care before we wrap up at our recharge station, remembering that it is critical to personal wellness in both the good times and the hard times. It's also something we find that camp professionals often struggle with, but we like to view it as recharging your batteries or making you feel a little bit more inspired. I forgot to find something to put here, but Rachel has something to say today.
Yeah, so I have learned this from my good friend Erin, and we mentioned this earlier. It's the importance of setting boundaries. And I know I'm doing a little bit of boundary resetting in my life. So consider what it is that's bringing you joy and fulfillment that you need to do. List out all the other things that you are doing, and then start to see where they're matching up and where the disconnects are. So if you have some time in your life, I suggest doing that and seeing if there are things that maybe it's time in this season to move away from. That's my tip for you for self-care this week.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We want to thank everyone for joining us beyond camp. We hope that you were able to connect and reflect with us as we journey beyond the property lines and bring camp with us. As we wrap up, we want you to be able to reach out and connect with us, myself and Rachel as well. So you can do that at beyondcamp@gocamp.pro. Please remember to check out our show notes at gocamp.pro/beyondcamp. And one last round of thank yous again to Erin for her time today and some enlightening and mic dropping moments, to the team at Go Camp Pro for holding space for these conversations, to ACA Illinois for their sponsorship and support of this idea, to our producers, Matt and Jotham. Thank you. I'm sorry. And to you, our listeners, your dedication allows us to keep moving forward. Beyond Camp is part of the Go Camp Pro podcast network. Check out all our other podcasts at gocamp.pro/podcasts. Go well and safely, friends. We'll see you next time.